마 샤잔도 년지 대티 요마래 된다도 마셰 강가셰 레레레치 티디게 강가 요래 된다 강가 지기치기 발마 쳐봐 요래 니만해셔서 엄마 주번 거네 지주바도 정말 된다도 쳐봐 강가 식장자 더 말이 된다 고난nhập 많이 주봐 요래 사티 저 요래 삼 따이나 농협에서도 양한도 농협에서도 말해 가르쳐 등사 로스는 칸에 짜자만더니 지체셔라. 근데 로스 저지 치도요 말이 치달라면서 나도지 어쩌. 임베차.
So here to begin with, Genla paid homage to he who, based upon his own seeing and experience, teaches then emptiness. So here, when we are looking at the entry to the middle way, entering the middle way, this is something where in the monastery, one doesn't necessarily receive a full transmission from the text beginning to end. You go through, you end up covering all of the kind of material that is within that text, getting the meaning of it. But a lot of people wouldn't say that they've received the full transmission, in that they don't get from the beginning to the end, like all of the words laid out, but all of the meaning comes through the course of that study.
뭐든지 된다 주베데 개첨보라. 된다데 바르마셔베셰. 이마 kenji shiwa tsodan tene tinema 조지바데 아디샤다 강가 짜가 빈드다 스파페라 어디서 마송 tene 라자 마부 짜갈 페테도 녜트 베제 교르탄다 거기 땡주 빼마보여라 선페 개첨보 깔레시브 잡도 하게마 셰자탄다 테사 삼르타데 아니 신에 녜마 로자도 베 깔레야부 잡샤삼 알레도 대상가서 빼서 시킬 거나 전제 야부요 할때 근데 교토에 가고 싶다래 어디에도 가서래 규바데 요래 동반이 규바신데도 맞던다시에 규바데 쏘 깨치거라 시코라 가던데 아니냐 연아 야부래 때문에 나다 고치제레레레 제 된다 시기시긴데 어디 동반이 규바데 지나고 지가 제시해서 많이 버서 되어라 네 숨샤바데 강가 빼제나를 뒤셔요라. 근데 제름부 송가 버리시네 고 사실 뒤지단 주고 레베트 상면한 뒤셔요라. 지나고 규바 파르마시바 뒤셔요라. 숨샤바데 그래서 법샤요란 뒤지게 지켜셔요라. 뒤제 이뭐지. 다단단 가서티 거네 엄마 줘봐. 얘도 산제 되는 통화기로 와.
So here there is an unbroken transmission lineage when it comes to the meaning of this text, right? So we have those kinds of great masters like Kamala Shila and then Atisha and all of those great translators who received the meaning of this text. And that has been carried on in this kind of unbroken tradition. And really, when we think about the translators of old, they had such incredible difficulty. Like, it's amazing that they were able to do what they did. Even now, with such good conditions, we know it's difficult to translate, but back then it was much more difficult. And so here there is this lineage, again, of the meaning of these words and this unbroken kind of lineage. Particularly, we can see in the commentarial tradition of like Jela Tsongkhapa and so forth, that all of the kind of meaning has been preserved and carried down in this unbroken transmission.
Oh, yeah, that is. 데이터 솔로가 담보대 년도 산제 전남 통화기로와 년도 산제 전남 통화기에서 산제 장주 선발에 총신 이제 선단이 선mel로다 장주 선이 계산하기죠 솔로가 담보대로와 년도 산제 전남 통화기에서 년도 택바 숨 쉬어라 년도 이 택바 랑제 택바 전부 숨 쉬어라 티나네고 년도다 랑제니부터라 대바 중모 살시라 드네 가서네 대바 전부들려 벌지 대바다 상하 대바 신이데 지거라 뒤에 년도에서거데 산제가 타르바토발이야 름바르데 숨송고도 지대 년도 되소리야. 네. 요번 저니 숨다 깔래 점나 타르와 토비야 요나. 아니 야부도 삼티마도 타르무 세나 대용금도 삼. 저절이 년도 되고 속여래. 요번 지시. 랑게도 야 깨버칭이다 깔래 잡구나. 타르와 토나 삼사래. 텔레 닝도 타르무. 배수시에 삼로 닝도 깨토요라. 텔레 랑게지 되고 왔어. 대과 전부대 심지어 탐지가 저도 전국세 연대 군대 이제 산재 고바토에 시도 개와 가정 거나 고 토에 지어는 저기도 삼사 가정 이나 깔래 접통돼 진에 깔래지 접쳐져서 저주 심게 사수나 어다 여과상 마게는 저기도 심지가 더 쳐야 돼 내가 저기도 삼사가 거 된대 손에 고 여정부 여도 전부 다른 뭐 근데 자네는 개과 전부 속여라 되지랑야
So here in the first verse, so Shravakas and middle level Buddhas arise from sovereign sages. The first line reads. So here we can see there are the three vehicles. There's the hearer's vehicle, the solitary realizer, the pratyeka vehicle, and then there is the Mahayana or the great vehicle. So we can sort of classify these into the lesser vehicle, striving for one's own liberation. And then among the Mahayana, the great vehicle, there is the perfection path and then that of the Vajrayana. So here we can then talk about sort of like three levels of liberation based upon the kind of resolve and mental fortitude of the practitioner. So hearers are those who really, they want to be liberated and they want to do so quickly. So within 2 or 3 lifetimes, they are striving to get out. And solitary realizers, pratyeka Buddhas, have a little bit more sort of mental fortitude, that they can strive for longer for that goal of their own liberation. But when it gets to the great vehicle, this is someone who thinks that for the sake of all sentient beings, they want to remove all faults and develop all good qualities, attain that state of perfect Buddhahood for the benefit of others, however long that might take, whether it's eons and eons, however long. And they have this thought, once they have generated bodhicitta, that no matter how long it might take to get to Buddhahood, that's okay. I don't need to get there quickly. I need to be benefiting other sentient beings, and that's their primary concern.
뭐야? 어디 가서 산재 좀 되게 추를 봐만 보소. 근데 참참이야. 두제 카두를 추송사게. 두제 대조고 삼발 세네. 야 추송고라. 다음에 수송샤나 고탄다. 다음에 시에주면도 고시에나 야보고도 삼마레스 탄다 마시에나 가르삼. 다 여배선데 시에서 텐데 용거라. 다 여바선 거야라. 어디 인디고 다 여바다 짐메다고 참을 숨바다 마숨바. 또 뒤에 감도 삼발을 때문에 무슨도 세계 여자고야 갑갑이야 인소에 갑갑 매소에 텐데 용거라. 여자 장도다 내던 도시니 치거라. 산재 좀 된데 송샤바 상마 양바이 버서 켈레고 뱅게바 요마레 뒤에 라랑 갑도지 삼배왕게 송샤바 때다 때는 거는 소거라. 근데 송여르다티 장도레세 그도 켈레나 마지게 된데 요라. 근데 뒤에 삼바 나라전에 그 버저가라하고 요나 단다 팽게 요다 가르치고는 개요마르 가요버데 샤셔라. 또 산재때 말에 뒤에 레레레 그 삼로다. 강가 감다 삼바다 다다로 마음바 강가 친구들다. 아니 최송 좀 메라메라 용거라. 근데 남배초나 장도다 내도 마보요레스. 대소소 제바제 소소로라 가라 바바요나. 당부 때도 telling 주게래. 마도 산재 남바 인수도 남바 송 산재 송샤바 강가 란주 그게 내가 요 말에 가시 상하데 매셔 템바시다 텐데 중니다 타바토에 티르라 가시에네 대과 첨부고 말 가시 대과 첨부고를 상하 소소소 로여쳐데 가래유나 텔 로저 자샤나 되기와라 마도 지기 남바 인수제 상마 산재 송샤게 상마 추탐제 켈레 그게 내가 요 말에 소소 로레 추송네 켈레 로로 마치네 소소 탄다 하고 아테 로저 자네 되기와라 어디인데 뒤에 감다 삼바다 나라저 남바 인신하고 소소를 틈바 기부이나 기부 중은 등 전부 디나시 택바 고마 마부 송샤도 소소소 감다 뛰기 양례시안이 되고 말도 상마 탐제 그 낭바래 택바 치부 켈링마도 이제 말해서 그때 상하 켈링마도 세트에서 말아 소소 간다가 갑도 소소 진짜 양례시안이 되고 야
So we can see that the Buddha, the Bhagavan, taught much Dharma, and the Buddha taught in a way that accords with the various dispositions and inclinations, the wants of beings. He is able to, based upon his direct knowledge of the minds of others, see that, well, if I were to say teach selflessness, this would be something that isn't good for that person. And so maybe temporarily I won't teach about that. So we see that within the Buddha's teachings, there are many different teachings. There are teachings that deal with impermanence and subtle impermanence and selflessness. We see in some places the Buddha talks about there being a self and so forth. And so really, because the Buddha has that ability to know the dispositions, inclinations, and wants of various beings, he teaches in accordance with that. And so that means that for us, when we approach the Buddhist teachings, we need to understand that some are provisional, they require interpretation, and others are definitive. We can't just take everything and say, oh, well, this is a Buddha's teaching, so I need to accept this directly, literally. But rather, we should recognize that it was taught for a purpose, that it was taught in accordance with the disposition, the inclination of that particular being. So here, we as ordinary beings, we don't know the minds of others. We can't see what their kind of inclinations are. So we just sort of teach whatever based upon what we think will be beneficial, what we think is helpful. But we should understand that the teachings, we really need to look at how the Buddha taught things for a particular purpose. There are things that we can't just accept directly, literally, but rather they need to accord with our mind, our way of thinking. So here we should approach the teachings in a way that accords with our mental level, our mental ability to understand something. So we should practice what accords with our own abilities, but we shouldn't be looking at like, oh, well, this person over here, they don't accept the Mahayana, and that's not okay. They shouldn't only accept the lesser vehicle, or oh, that person only accepts the Mantrayana, and that's not okay. But we rather need to understand the way in which the Buddha gave teachings, and that it's for the various dispositions of beings.
야 다 주부시면 맞잖아
Yeah.
정말 다 년도 세대서 년도 세대 택바 전부 년도 도 산제 좀 된데 쇼가 걸려 산제 근들이야 차르다게 또 마차 년도 온 거라 마차된 년도를 친 거라 저 택바 전부 쇼 손데 년게 와데 이나 소속의 저 냠리시에 지금 타르바토바 저 지금마도 심지어 탐지 같은도 산지고 와토바세 저 지금 말아 냠리 마셔세 저 마셔 이니 샹리아 저거요 산지 된데 송그시 태과 쳔보 돈도 년게 소리야 산지 고바 토야테 저거요라 셰기요라 제가 년토스 태과 쳔비초도 산지 가르스나티니 근데 라게 택과 첨부니 아무리 맞아버리나 좀 맞아나 샹리아 더바시 시기오라 세단에 되시고라 되돌이야 최선도 당부 타르바토야 셔도 요번 타르바토야 셔도 덴바시 쇼데서 거라 덴바시 손에 어디지 야 되지 랍샤나
So here, the first line where it says hearers or Shravakas, this is really referring primarily at the time of the Buddha, most of the disciples around him were of this type, of the Shravaka lineage. And although they listened to the Mahayana teachings, the Buddha gave various explanations of teachings, including Mahayana teachings. But although they hear these teachings, they are mainly practicing only for their own liberation. And the reason that they are called hearers is based upon the kind of teachings of the Buddha that they hear. They are then able to explain that to others, even if, again, they are not practicing the Mahayana. This is something that they have heard. And so this is the origin of the term hearer.
야 전에야 그 년도 산제 정시도 랑제될 순거라 년도 산제 정시도 산제 셔도 주다 대코나니를 로드 개버들 상계시기서라 빼마 가게바다 되돌 상계 계세든 방불 두겨라 년도 산계에서도 랑제될 수라 대코나니를서 단내주 뭐네들 로드 개버선다 상계시라 시거라 오늘 저는 산제 땅아주 전에 산제 원내대 그 말이데 근데 설레 시거라 년도 산제 등에서도 랑제될 수거라 산제 등들 또서 타바토발라 여름부 갈래 cap통게 템바 시고데 계시케바 마송네 근데 양라 중이 있고네 고안 죽베 큰데레시 고안 독베 큰데레시 가서라 군에 야모서 텐데 로중 로도스 동에 템바 군주 템바 송거라 남장게 출로중 로도스 꼭대다 람데 송거라 티 계시케바 교마바도스 코다데시 인주다 랑제 년되게 년년게 어떨로치 담부치다 진짜래서라 랑게 제들 되게 년도때 소 삼로당게 삼로당다 거라 지소 냠도 대 최초 냠도 대 에네 소소 최대 샬라셰 진짜 제일 가보요라 소나 줘봤어라 랑게데 소소 녀데니 에네 소소 지부 대제 냠레 제제 대 까치게 그리려 줘다 내봐요 내가 시다 라지부가 시루다 보세 랑제세 녀데 야보지 강근염도 대 네 소소 지부 대 삼로다 대 진짜 랑제세 네 개바 마부깔에 잡던 게 또스 년들에 로스님도 쳐야다 유름 분배 통계 어떤데 야 대반 중인데 송거라 가서라 년들 랑제이 대반 송거라 야
So then, for the hearers or the Shravakas, the Buddha primarily taught the Four Noble Truths. And then here we get to this next term. Here I have it translated as middle level Buddhas or Pratyeka Buddhas. And so here, when we talk about the word Buddha, or in the Tibetan Changchup, this sort of second syllable that implies their mind, their wisdom has expanded completely with regard to suchness. And so when we're talking about a Buddha who has reached full omniscience, that is a level that a Pratyeka Buddha or a middling level Buddha has not reached. So we use that term, although it's not as though they have achieved the same level as a Buddha. And here, a solitary realizer or a Pratyeka Buddha is very knowledgeable in terms of the Four Noble Truths, and particularly the 12 links of dependent origination, understanding how it is that we engage in samsara, have that forward order of the 12 links, and then the reverse, wherein one extricates oneself from this system of samsara. And so here, when it comes to a Pratyeka Buddha versus a Shravaka, the Shravakas sort of tend to live in society. The name that they're given, this hearer, is implying that they hear. They're sort of in groups. They hear various teachings and then give explanation to others. Whereas a solitary realizer, as the name implies, tends to be more, sometimes they are given the term rhinoceros-like, that they are off by themselves. They are studying in sort of isolation, and they have more mental fortitude than hearers in that they are able to practice this path, develop this for a longer period of time.
Oh yeah. 당년도 산제 정세데 대코나니라 로드 개반 중아 송단 정세 년도 두두도스 텔레총을 셔네 산제 좀 되데 두두다고 타르토고 산제 소라 년도 산제 개남 통화기에서 토바 산제 좀 된데 잠불링을 폐면에 추소도 당보다가 대과 첨부터 된 송요 말에 영자체 송요 말에 년도다 란제나시 타르바토야 돼서 거에 동에게 나오라데 민족계야다 안에 들었는데 타르바토야 돼서 저는 송요라 어디는 산제 정시 라사게체 그니들이 산제 좀 된데 추소발 때네 내 잠불린 데리아고 르베제고 년도를 람레테 타르바토 란제 람레테 타르바토게 된데 용거래세 년도 산제는 동아지 산제 추소발 때네 네 라게 tarwata lamdo sungo to chebares. Tunda tungbares. Sanje chumden de chek sombal tene. Yende lamla locho che. Trachon bete tomge tsungora. Yende sanje denam. 통화jes tuwa sanje chumden de sungla. Tosam gusun chebala tene. Ene koala ngebanjo. Rangege tabato. Koala ngebanjo. Yende tarwato tende topgere eske sonda. Sanje sungla tene kebare eske. Yeah.
So again, the sort of middle level Buddhas are so called because they haven't reached the sort of full culmination of their intelligence or their wisdom expanding with regard to suchness, but have done so to a certain degree, not to the full sort of culmination of Buddhahood, but yet they have developed their minds and their understanding of suchness. Now, here again, this first line reads, Shravakas and middle level Buddhas arise from sovereign sages or from the Buddha Shakyamuni. When the Buddha attained enlightenment, he didn't widely teach the Mahayana initially, but primarily taught the kind of methods for liberation, how one first generates an attitude of renunciation, and in turn then engages in the methods to be able to get out of samsara, to attain that state of one's individual liberation. So here, where it says that these Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas arise from or are born from sovereign sages, this is really referring to the fact that independence upon the Dharma that the Buddha taught, they were able to develop their own minds and attain that state of an arhat or that state of an individual liberation. So based upon developing a sense of renunciation, seeing the sufferings of samsara, one then pursues this kind of path, and it comes about due to listening to the Dharma of the Buddha. So therefore they arise from.
Oh yeah. Nyandu sanje denam tuwa jesira. Sanje janju semba le chung shishira. Sanje de gade si chongaresana. Sanje de janju gu sem kombala tene. Ene sanje bare sigara. Koala ngeban chung, tarwa tunye she, raji bu tabataban jigimedo sam kone, simje tamje gitonda tuwe shido. Yungu se yunde kundengi sanje jikoba togu sam, janju chodo semke. Oh, tambu janju semba jor. Janju semba jola tene, ene chambada nyingi paru chimbatu nyamli chene, sanje bare sigara. Oh, sanje janju semba le tushidora. Nyandu sanje dina tungaji, sanje de gonde chongaresana, oh, te, tambu janju chodo tuki ra. Oh, tene padu keba tamu sosa, oh, tene shene chonga. Janju gu semke ne. Oh, semje tamje gu tunga tuwe shido, samlo kone ra. Semje tamje koya tunga le tawari cha koyo samne. Te chido sanje ju koba togu samne. Janju gu semke. Mumba janju gu semke. Ranju gu janju gu semke so. Janju gu semke ne. Janju semba kyu ne. Ene janju semba de lamya kom gong kong sa tambu nyi bache. Ene sanje ne. Tanda sanje chumde de chunga de esi gara. Yendo sanje de tonga. Sanje janju semba le dushi. Tanda de karisi orisana. Sanje de tambu janju semba. Janju chodo semke. Chamba da nyingji. Roa janju gu semke ne. Ene sanje bare esi. Tishe gara. Yendo sanje de tonga. Sanje janju semba le chungshi. Ya. O tishe gara.
So then the next line reads, Buddhas are born from bodhisattvas. So here, when we ask, well, where is it that this Buddha, who then leads Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, comes from? Well, it is from a being who, first sort of generating that attitude of renunciation and then thinking about liberation, then thinks, well, my own liberation alone is not enough, but rather I want to be of benefit to all sentient beings. And so based upon generating that supreme kind of attitude, this attitude of bodhicitta, they then develop their love and compassion, engage in the six perfections in order to then become a fully enlightened Buddha. So here, when it comes to, well, where does a Buddha arise from? They come from bodhisattvas. They come from these beings who first generate that attitude and then over the course of 3 countless eons engage in various activities for the sake of all sentient beings. So it begins with this kind of aspirational bodhicitta or aspirational mind of awakening, and then the kind of engaging mind of awakening, which then leads them to proceed through the various grounds and eventually attain that state of complete perfect enlightenment where they have removed all faults and developed all good qualities. So here, when it comes to the sort of progression, again, Buddhas lead to the arising of hearers and hearers and pratyeka Buddhas, and in turn, Buddhas themselves are born from bodhisattvas.
Oh yeah. Tanda ko sanje de tambo tene chanju semba yorne. Ne a remye sanje ko yora. Chanju semba ra chanju semba shenda jambe yang la soba. Tezo chanju semba shenge roba che. Ra chanju chodo semke. Nyele sanje nyele de chanju semba yogudo. Chanju semba yone sanje yogura. Ani chanju semba shenge roba che otin tene chores. Sanje de chanju semba roa sem chung chanju semba shenge ani roba che otin tene sanje bre esora sanje chanju semba. Niji semba ni so melo ta chanju semba kese na mi chos. Ne niji semba ni so melo ta chanju semba kese na mi chos. Chanju semba konde kondo ya pe ne sa chu sanje ko ba to ye de kandre cheni yongure sana. Niji semba semje tamje 동해대 다가 지기 인삼배 와 니지sem다 자주죠 니지sem다 니소멜로다서 동반이 또게 싫어서 니소멜 자주셈 심제 탐제 같은도 사제죠 고마토가 저기 인삼 타체는 닝도 타체 자주셈 무심다 죽심세요라 어 진짜 두 개네 애네랑 줄이 개네 애네 거네 거도야 배네 네 사주다就是要这呢，上节吧的说的，上节前就什么了，就是应急什么的，你说没路的，前就是呢，开始那么就是的，应急全部公布了的呢，呀，应急属切着呢，什么他们在东北的这个这个大个这个什么啥，是吧？俺这个什么啥讲，俺当到街头嘛，那个上节讲可是有那个那就公布头发些呢。这几个人什么讲呢？年纪什么大？哦，我对这今年当不年纪什么给，到底有啥什么的？年纪什么大？你说没了，当不你多个，是的，是吧？讲究什么？哦，对了，对呢，你讲究什么？你什么了？讲究什么？改善那么久，改善那么久些的，改善讲究什么？当不就说了年纪什么给块吧，他说，往年人家当不。동반이 또 왜 싫어게 알아들어라. 그래서 근데 telletene 자주 sem께네. 고네 kon도 앞에네 상계게 돼서 봐라. 이제 심당이 소멜로다 자주스네 계세 남기 교수데. 네 계세 자주 sem바 joala. 이제 sem보다 동네 또 왜 싫어다. 자주 sem송바디 교체는 담보 거래서요 말아. 이제 sem보다 담보 거도 가실래라. 네 동반이 또 왜 싫어 되는 것도 여기 요래. chanju sem ke sa sune chanju semba jorwa chanju semde chanju sembe kyure ga mara te kone kondo ya pe ya kyuche tambu te ni ji che ro an tende che ya kone kondo pe kyure se tende ko gora da
So here then it continues in the second half of this verse where it says the compassionate mind and non-dual cognition as well as the awakening mind, these are the causes of bodhisattvas. So here when we ask, well, how is it that someone becomes a bodhisattva who then becomes a Buddha? Well, first one generates an attitude of bodhicitta based upon sort of seeing other bodhisattvas being aided by those who have generated such an attitude, and that is helpful for us then to for ourselves generate this. So bodhisattvas here realize that their own liberation alone is not sufficient, but rather they have this drive to relieve the suffering of all sentient beings without exception. So here, this compassionate mind, the first thing listed as a cause, is that wish to relieve the suffering of all sentient beings, this great compassion. And then there is the the non-dual cognition, which is referring to this wisdom realizing emptiness. And when one has increased the kind of compassionate attitude to such a degree, one has this kind of force, this sort of fortitude of mind that says, I myself will take on the responsibility of freeing sentient beings from their sufferings. And so then one, based upon that attitude of generating the awakening mind, then increases and develops that to proceed through the 10 grounds all the way to the state of Buddhahood. So in dependence upon having this kind of compassion, one then develops that sort of attitude again that it's not enough to just want sentient beings to be relieved of their sufferings, but I myself will do this. I will free them from their sufferings. And so that compassionate attitude here, when one develops, that acts as a cause for developing bodhicitta. And once one has bodhicitta, then you are considered to be a bodhisattva. Now, there are some bodhisattvas of sharp faculties who have already developed the wisdom realizing emptiness. So that non-dual cognition may come first in the case of someone with a sharp kind of mental faculties. But to become a bodhisattva, again, here, when we say that the awakening mind is a cause for that, this is really the cause that develops and furthers the bodhisattva all the way to Buddhahood. So really the causes here are identified as three: the compassionate mind, non-dual cognition, and the awakening mind.
야, 다던다 대신고도 전주 선바원도 대신에 담보 인지 전부다 수기요라. 인지 전부다 자주 섬도 수기요라. 동님마도 제. 오늘에는 담보 동리도 안테네 인지 전부다 자주 섬도 수기요라. 릭실로 어떤데 용거라. 티셔라. 아니 자주 섬 때야게 dingi gyundo chawda kashali nyiji chenpo chulundo chawda kashali dongi dobe shiro chulundo dwa wangbundo du keba kir tuche samlo tangtang keba kirwa o tuche wangdi wane keba shidwa ta chanju semde keso na chanju sembe gyu regme dwa chanju sembe gyu ine chanju sem keso na chanju sembe resa ra chanju sem kone konto ya pene sangye kyulidu resa tinde kawne digyara o tichi lamne ya.
So here, those of sort of duller faculties will first generate an attitude of compassion, and then this attitude of bodhicitta, followed by developing their wisdom, realizing emptiness. Now, those of sharp faculties may first have that wisdom, realizing emptiness, and then later develop the compassion and bodhicitta. So there are differences sort of in the way that these minds are generated based upon one's relative faculties. Now here again, where it says that the awakening mind is the cause of bodhisattvas, here we need to understand that yes, once one generates unfabricated bodhicitta, one becomes a bodhisattva. So really, this is the kind of cause that enhances and develops that attitude that leads to Buddhahood. It is the cause of developing full Buddhahood.
간지 쟁이 개별로도 편조돼 제라 서와니지 신부츠요라 간지 쟁이 개별로도 편조돼 개별로도 산제 공부 로도 표준 처보단 나와 좋아 개별로도 표준 처보단 산제 공부 더 발라서라 간지 쟁이 개별로도 편조돼 사변단에서 산제 공부 더베 니지 신부들 사변다버려서라 당부 바다에 사변다 간지 쟁이 겨울로 사변다네 도마 개셔 사변다버려 간지 저원이 신부츠요다 간지 쟁이 겨울로도 편조 겨울로도 표준서버서도 산제 고바 표준서버 더 발라서라 로도세에 그래서는 대한민발 때문에 지다 신가를 시다바이나 레부야 미소는 현다 롱죄발 팽기와라 산제 사선에 산제 연대데 구순도 연대데 뒤제 현다야 되네 대 산제 송을 롱죄발 때문에 더섬고서 제발 때문에 산제야 되는데 줄로라 뒤로도로도 민다다 간지 쟁이 겨울로도 편존데스 겨울로도 표준서관 중아 네 네 당부 도마께서 사변다버려서 인지 신부대 이제 전부 매나네 사분 마담나 좀더 영화 요마로 현대 lonche 어디 내셔래서 간지 생이 저로도 편전데 사분 다네 토마게 저 사분 다 빼라 춘데 유네도 빼라라 공대 공도야 빼와라 추단다오래 발도 추다 이마 포추 따도 채우라 추매나네 감도라 이제 간지 생이 저로도 편전데 사분 다네 이제 전부 쓰여다 Pardo, quando pela la chuda ras. Jenny, girl the Pensaba than the Pela chuda. Yere do lojo nella mimba to do. Tamasan gene, Jebu ya mimba than doris. Jebu means on a shenda launcher yogura. Don't do them the mamina launcher yomara, didn't I say? Tar and a son changes somebody san gene. Rakian could say your necunde. Landor Gene, Tamja Shengen, Tamja Panga Chasona, to Shandala Koran Pebe Lamde, Shalaya, or Tatambu de Samlata or Jenny de Combut in the Samlata or Martin Dressin, Yoan Yamutin, Yesuma Sungura, this only Shandala Pendo Yogara. What you do? Taman Drebu Mimba than Dawes, Niji Chimbudit, Sanja Yukomato, Toma Gesha Sabra, Pado Kona Conto Pevala, Chudandra. Tamane Kesho and Jebu Mimbadanda, Sanjabala, Jebu Mimbadanda. Can you sing it, Javelo Dopento, the Sabentane, Ella should Kona Conto Piazza. Should I hear do launch a bit, to Chenam, you do launch a bit, Kusanto, you and their song la launch a Tabaja, Sambaja, Combasha, the Raya, Chanchu, Semke Andreas. Longinella Mimbata on Dirty, Chita, Tomani Shikis. Tambo de Omajuba Casa, Ninja Sembola to actually, Caressing Ninja Sembola, Joel Lotopus of Anjualia, Tonda Passum do que show a rechas, teach an Ninja Sembola Chasa Sungara.
So then turning to the next verse, which reads, as compassion alone is accepted to be the seed of the perfect harvest of Buddhahood, the water that nourishes it, and the fruit that is a long source of enjoyment, I will praise compassion at the start of it all. So here, to attain that state of Buddhahood, now here it refers to it as the perfect harvest of Buddhahood, but really we're talking about attaining that state of Buddhahood. We need to plant a seed. We need to create the kind of causes that will lead to that. And when one has developed fully that perfect harvest of Buddhahood, then others are able to enjoy that based upon hearing the teachings and so forth. They are benefited through that state of Buddhahood. So first, then, compassion alone is accepted to be the seed, as in this is the very thing that will develop into that harvest. If we don't plant any kind of crops, any sort of seeds, then nothing will come from that. So compassion is like the seed that will lead to the perfect harvest of Buddhahood. And not only that, it's like the water that nourishes it. And so here, if we don't actually take care of our crops, if they don't get water and sunlight and so forth, they're going to dry up or not be able to produce anything. And so here, compassion is like that water that nourishes that seed, leading to the perfect harvest of Buddhahood. And then finally, in the end, it is like the fruit that is the long source of enjoyment, in that when we achieve this ripening of Buddhahood, a state of Buddhahood being one in which one has eliminated all faults and developed all good qualities, you have all of the knowledge of what is to be adopted and what is to be abandoned based upon your own experience. You are able to then convey that to others, to teach this path to others. And so it is like that ripening result. The thing, it is like that fully ripened harvest that is able to be enjoyed by others, in that once one attains Buddhahood and is able to teach, to give the Dharma, others can hear and contemplate, meditate on that, and thereby themselves proceed toward that state. So given the importance of compassion, Chandrakirti here at the beginning of the Madhyamaka Avatara chooses to praise compassion at the start of it all in this second verse.
Oh, yeah. Dichele, Tambungash Tala Shinjura. Tambungash Tala Shinjuchi. Dagan dishing will a chakib. Sujin said the Rama by $1 Nishi to my talent is. 담보 아시 달라신지 단인지 전부 깨단 길로도 쉐거라 로아tam나 인지 전부 깨거라 당가라도 강가 그냥 강가 용서 담보 간에 연구도스네 담보 아시 아 삼상아티 라오아시그라 아디 소소그 나의 뭘 주베스를 삼고도 안가랑게 여서를 삼고도 소보를 셈셈을 되지 안가랑 랑게 뭐에 줘 ngati ngaragi yo samsare tuda soboda semda soatan duchi roba yena mena samlu ko medwa rangwene yo ba sete sora rangwene yo ba rangshin gi yo ba shenda roba ko mara koran rangshin ki tu yo re sara rangwete rangshin tu range mo yo tu sosu mo yo tu arazu samlu nalia 내가 가지 안가랑게 지치겠어 안가란데 정도 라베 치셔나 칸에 치셔나 그래서 지어야 돼. 나랑 지고 삼기도 와. 랑은에서라. 담보 아시 달라신. 생게. 또때 타라만 보여라. 타라만 보여라. 가르삼 땅ton나치 삼로 코나 약으로. 나랑 아서라. 야 현대게 맞네. 생게데 소고다 셈다 소알레 로스 지여베서도 와. 풍불에 tension 베타시라. 치료받아도 셴다 죽다만 셴다도 되어시라 소불에 백화가 다요래 샘레 백화가 다요래 소환도 시도시 백화가 거라 다 나가요래 섬기다 시겨라 풍불에 tension 베타시라 치료받아서 남바체네 티켈링 말와 이나 어디에 섬놓고 나르기도 풍불에 tension 베타요 말에 섬나 나미레와 나미레와 mi disa soku la tenchi mandrini mi yo mara disa kasore sosu te pumbu dendel na mado sosu mi chag mara kansa chag mara soa tiru nyonge chi mena mi chag mara tesu kangal teshin del ni mi chagra ina ngazu samlu nala timido tambo lo lenji samlu nala sede ngara rangi chigiyobe 라마세 링링스그레 가시 링링스에 때때 고단교 실리시라다요 맞다 삼을 다서도 다다 디갈레오로 체카르 식세데 치고에 던다 서샤라 디고에 던다 서샤라 다던단데스 담보 아시 달라 신조제스 담보 거라 자와 축세데 간에서다 삼사가 라마로 치와라 담보 아시 달라 저도 나와지 로가시 여바식 좋아 랑원에 줘봐 랑신기 줘봐 랑경어에 줘봐시도 다담바 줘봐 템바 줘봐 나라서 나와나 신유에 섬을 거기도 지디 싸와대 용사대 경강의 용사 싸와대에서 와라 담봉 아시 달라 신주진스 신게 tinde시 여네 신게 와마르 너네 추네 도마메바나 곰다추네 네 담봉 아시 달라 신주시 뒤에 되는 게 네 숙취부터 봐라. 나의 로제. 네 메시지도 저 메시지. 그 사자세 정말 좋다도 저기 와라. 당분간 삼자 안에 나의 삼자 나의 나와. 신사 숙취부. 나이와 이제 나도 나이와 이제 뭐라. 아니 치료한 거부터 저래 이제 봐. 가사가 다지데 최기 단지스도. 나요 민가요 나와요 나네. 아니 지금부터 저래 띵해. 오늘 신이 이야기가 말아. 띵아도 가서라. ገብte 뼈도 떠서 하고도. 소수 나이에서 소수 지인이 되어라. 돕자 그자 배신에 참 컨저를 살아 소수 게리고도. 어디인데 가서라. 슈라 겹지. 나이 세월마다 그때 저들을 퍼져레마다 소속해 자요 말아. 소소 우주를 겹쳤대 생겨는 말이지. 어디인데 담봉 아시 달라 신주셔스 뒤서와시. 내가 나요 아티요 그래. 라와시오. 아니 현자 숙심이라. 아주 무슨 도대도 현자게 되다. 내가 지시 같은 애인벤지 사조라. 애인나 가이나 내게요 말에 단대랑이네 현대 미천도나 되게 당분간시 달라 신주지 다긴 디싱을 차기 봐. 수준이 찬다르다 빼자라. 수준이 찬다 라마 매바인 돌아니지 좋아돼. 아니 가르치고 와서나 네 수준이 추고셔야 돼. 제가 얘네 뇌제를 마부터 하셔라. 아니 대표네 슈기도 마코는 뇌제도 마시 맨에 추딜래. 네 야한테 슈간 그 간시 약해온 거라. 야 추디 파슈 야한테 만나도 스토거라. 총바만 뇌제 마부터 하셔라. 그래도 만들도 그 답제 야인도 답제 타라 세통에 요마 레라우션도 그래. 야 텐데 코디나 추간서도 야 도스칼레 야 요한테 가보라. 사망에 run줘야 돼. 야 텐도 야 될 샤네 되어라. 수준이 찬다. 수준이 중고데. 네 야인의 마도도 답시 마보다 야연도 가고 마도 레라고 텐데셔네. 네 코아코네 동에 용대 요래 세워라. 수준이 찬다. 라와 매바에 돌아니지 주가 될라데스. 되네 코알라 코네 수신지 중고 규모 디피네 야팀 마틴시에 쇼라 디 도메 마루다 나다가 있어야 되리도 아니 내가 야보다 더 시에 저와 야보다 내버세네 마한도 야용에도 수신지 주고 코아나시 코데요 수신지한테 라마 매바에 돌아니지 좋아네 코아코네 동에 용되기도 좀 배때다 송바 근데 상물단에 거 동에 트렌드기 사와데 키요레 송거라 야 마운다 마스도 야 어야
So here I'll try to get all of this. Here in the next verse, then, is really how we go about generating compassion. So, first, with the thought, I am, they cling to a self. Then, with the thought, mine, they become attached to things. Like buckets on a water wheel, they turn without control. I bow to the compassion that cares for such suffering beings. So here, when we look at like where does our trouble, our sufferings really come from? It is from this sense of I. Like we have this thought of I, like I am existent in and of myself, in my own right, like from its own side. It seems as though there is this I, that this person, this self that is really truly existent, inherently existent. Like we think like we do some kind of activity and we say, well, I'm doing that. We don't think that like, well, our hands or our mouth or other things are involved. It seems like there's this I, this person, this being that is carrying that out, independent of all of those other things. So we can think about it too in the way of like the kind of self that is propounded by non-Buddhists, where they would say that there is something other than the aggregates that is this self. And we can sometimes have this sense of there being something sort of separate, apart, other than our form, our feelings, our consciousness, our karmic formation, and our discernment and so forth, that there is like an I, a person that is somehow apart from that. But when we really think about it, like to say like I am a human, other than being connected with that particular form, like we can't posit a human in absence of that. And so other than being dependently designated upon a particular collection of aggregates, or like we can't speak of a person in isolation of their consciousness or their feelings and so forth. So here we should be investigating and looking at that kind of innate sense of an I, that's sort of like something that's almost like concrete or solid, existing in and of itself. And again, here the words are less important than the meaning that we are trying to get at. Words are things that we make up to try to help us with the meaning. So here, this kind of sense of an I as being like separate, set up from its own side, ultimately existent, truly existent. This grasping at an I, that sense of an I, is really the source of all of our trouble. We are so habituated to this since beginningless time. We have this feeling of there being an I, and then based upon that, as it says in the next line, then with the thought mine, they become attached to things. So we have this thought that there is this I existent in and of its own right. And then there are the things that sort of belong to it. So my body, my mind, and we extend beyond that, like my eyes, my ears, and so forth, but then even into my land, and look at how we as humans are able to sort of apportion everything out and hold it as being ours. And so we go beyond the kind of just the aggregates even to other external phenomena. So there are these two types of grasping at a self, grasping at the self of persons and grasping at the self of phenomena. And so we make such effort at this. Like we really think that there is some I that is really truly there, and we try to like attain what that thing wants and so forth, when there isn't really anything that exists in that way. Now here, this is likened to being I've seen it as like a bucket and a well, but it's really like buckets on a water wheel. There's I mean, we can see in India or other places where these things are turning, so they're pulling water up, and so it's much difficult to come up, and then going down is quite easy. You're sort of, and when that bucket or the sort of the buckets on this water wheel go down, they tend to sort of like bump against the sides and so forth. So here, without any sort of autonomy due to this grasping at an I and then mine, this first cause of ignorance, this means that these beings cycle without any sort of autonomy, any sort of freedom. And so looking at them, looking at these beings who are in this situation, Chandrakirti then says, I bow to the compassion that cares for such sentient beings, suffering beings.
Oh, yeah. Oh, Tatanda Koka Soda. Tatili Digit. Ngaranzu Karsoda. Open Angazo Tambu Zambuli Milchayandi. Sajatu Kangang Ecosi Omara. Kangan Yamdo Chitakebato Shindo to say any Roshagdoa. That's Yamani Kaligali Kashe Tabu Japseting and this Jimashine Kaligal Shara. Tadanda Saja Regina Pen, Today Koshika give us on the deep, but don't is Zurashik Jagua. Yota Kangatane Gudua. Tambuni came to Tinga as and then as the Nanganso say. And the conso say, and then Saja in a tessa de Dinga, shed the bully corante, Michila water. Don't do the dinner can get soldiers Hamala water, Mato. Tambunia dikira Saja, Kayomara. Chemanga just so then the society Dinga Sudera. Puchunjo Kalishitaka Yomara, Puchunjo de Jena, Ratsemburace Madong, the Kurda, Shitaki Medoa. Taya church and Saja, Mirida Chulo, Anechik, Yoda Mabunga as a Soshara. What you do, Karsora. Tingadung was some good to Gudua. Ah, says Shibuchi, and then so I say, Nacho Shuk Chadacha. And a Pajo de la Netich never touch him, and then any Tarzi, the Kankayongora. Oh, the Shuk Church, riding at the Hakuda. Sajarichina, Sajeta, Shangonation, Sajetsomara, Mitsora, Tinatanga, Kansa de Sora, Tapungoneter, Tilitungur, Tilicat, Mudata, Sajeta. This Mota de Shemos. O Tatunda Caso, Tamungash, Tala Shinjuch, and a target dishing all the Sajivas. Kenetanya Takangura. Kiranzo, social, Kiranzo Pajo, change the imbequich, change the Yabude. Manzo Yahut as an Digdo Nangwich and the church Tangbude. Shala Tawaba said, Rake Chishu in Chera. Ranga Chishu in Gara, Nami Chishu in Gara, Lumba Chishu, Yabasha. And a Kara Chishu de Degree. Titondal Shala Tawach and the Digmare Chera. Rangetanda Yabu to it, Kangasiat and the Shala Tawach and Digmas. Saban to nine do to a rank Shibuchi Karchia de Sena. Or to the mail I think as Nacho da Shenshos, Shenshasu, Nacho de Shambashu. Pajo de Lane, Tamachia, Mine Saturn Shinsi, Sena to Naka Saturn Shin to Shisha de Uta. Or Tijila Mea. Think I just send the Sui over the Hakodwa. Shuchembo. Oh, yeah.
So, Here, like for example, like when we think about when humans first sort of became human in this world, there wasn't a sort of sense of personal property, like kind of apportioning everything to individual owners. But we would sort of enjoy the environment as a collective. Like this is our sort of collective environment. And now we can see that we have come to a place where we really have a sense of, oh, well, this is my property and that is their property. And we like apportion things down to almost like the particles. Like every little thing has to be sort of, this is ours or this is theirs. We make such effort in that. But really, when we think about it, this world that we live in is really the domain of all sentient beings. All of the beings who are in this world have some sort of ownership of this place that we are in. Like when we think about like small children, for example, they sort of enjoy their environment, they play around, they don't have so much of a sense of like, oh, this is mine, this is my people, my side, and so forth. But rather are less sort of attached to those things. As we get older, we have more of a sense of, oh, well, this is my family, my people, my property, and my country, and so forth. And this is something that we can establish sort of directly for ourselves. That when we have this strong sense of I, like us and them, when the other side then does something that is disagreeable to us or that we don't like, we immediately feel this kind of anger. And here, when it comes to human survival, it's really not about sort of the survival of the property, but how do we take care of each other? And when we look at this, and again, we can establish this through our own experience, that like all of our trouble really comes from this. When we have a strong sense of I and mine, and then in turn want to cause harm to others who are in the out group, this is the source of our troubles. We can have a sense of like I and my side and my people as being most important, but if we can come to understand that we shouldn't harm others, this is in our self-interest, then it's okay. But as long as we sort of see others as being like rocks and stones, as sort of inanimate objects that we don't really need to think about, and whatever we do to them, okay, whatever, it doesn't matter, then this is the problem. We can have a sense of like, well, I and my group are most important, but I shouldn't harm others. I don't want to harm their groups because that's going to, in turn, harm us. And so this is something where we should really kind of come to understand it and know it from our own personal experience.
Oh yeah, ale. Oh, kaisa kawale so. Sujinda rama ba dola ni chi watale. Dwa yo e chui na da ta de de chi de tel pera cha she ta de de. Ya. Ta de tanda nga jo chola mi be ni ji se wara. Tanda de ni chi de mi da ba ta de sha ti ba. Al de. Tan dwa yo e chui na gen da wa dar. Dwa yo e chui na gen da wa dar. Yo da se do. Ngaranzo se go dwa ka ga. Chulia Dawe Sunye de Chagra Chunalma. And the Chudi Lagba Yosun, Sunye de Nimdo de Yotegra, or Tin Ashes were and draw. You a Chunagadawata. Chunagadawate, Chudilla Lumbuja Duzako, Sunye de Nimdo Yotegra, or Tishin to Specha Yora. Naranzo attended draw somebody, Kishi, without was on the Kutan King on Conjuando de Yora. You are kitchen, you are the day. Do you a tree nang in the water yotans? Young teacher could you do? Then I sang around kitchen join do yara. Then around some nangi or madamato. Some tanako have co lelaborator watosa. Then I'm going to somebody dead, Miss Teddy or somebody dead or till a colosago to shoot on go to Utango to Nalog Nanjata to Sata Kanga, Lega Shibuchogua, Chilogis Lunta Kanga, Kogua, the colosago to Niago, Mamuchi Chen Mato Sembuchi Terrachimara. So Keji Kajikan Yondo Yara. Kudan Kangi Akegora. Kudan Kangi Wangia Soderwa, Nanga Ranch and the Chit so they are not Tagra, Teomara. chi sa chu me long ki chunga nang ge sha ta tra da kyu ba da sa wa da tra wa da chi ke u ta ya da she bo che le te de ora machine ngone computer to halere machine ngone nga zo re de to a she bo che te zo kangal te chen de ne le ga re che che so bo re che kare ne ti pa sa na ke wa ti chi do de yo ra mo te ndu ka so ra 깨지깨지긴 줄에 메다봐도 야보자 하고 나야 소소 선배 메다봐서 오라 메다봐서 다 선부셔 돼야 됩니다 봐 미션 돼야 되러 당가 선부 돼요 됩니다 티 메다봐 임베도 교단 쟁게 와게 그도 야 깨고도 때마다 가가야 선부셔 돼주고 남아도 내내 선부셔 돼셔 돼 라하신 되게 오마라 교단 쟁 마보실은 치사 좀 멜로 나게 돼 아마를 전에 단단한 야선시 대고도 참 메다고 싶으시래 되어라 메다버리더라 참 좋아 남 나라서 참 요에 쉬나긴 다왜 숙련하시 텔레 롱레 소버도 요네 추도 요도 저도 냠도 요요시 되고 대요라 디나시래 소요라 진도 소소 메다버도 야보지 하고나 아니 심지어 현다 대하마고네 땅진 거하게 주시 처바도 땡땡 소리지 타고라고 싶지 진짜 아니 당진게 와게 레 미기 아마부 산도 되어라 아니 내중원에 하마고래 삼제 인지교월 땡게 와라 전에시 로아요에 추이나긴 나와 따로 요당하시 아주 시계반의 연구가 솔라 선바셰자와 솔라 선바셰 대야되시오라 소소 미제 대야더라 심비 깨지 레시메스 심비 깨지 용도다 파삼다 수삼다 지간대로 지금도 가서 가서 대바다 마음바다 다다들도 대라 용도도 어디나 신경을 와래서 깨지게 솔라 선바셰자와 심비 깨지 레시메스 그 땡이 매력 받잖아 다니시봐 말아줘 때 하고요 말 소소때 탑으로 쉬었지 인베 나와샤지 때어라 땅진여라 땅진시도 든든진이 쓰기라 든든지 나매도 단다 여반나시 단다 되게리 여대베서네 띵간주 삼기도 와 나가기만 아 단다 뭐 대그리 삼사 때문에 지내고 대도 있는 맨에 땡대요 말에 규단 쟁이 온 거도 그라 로아요에 추에난 건 나와더라 요아 땡대랑 신도 통하네 내 심장에 인지게 해줘라 어디 쉬어라 졸라매 베니치스 야 됐으나 맞아
So then moving on to the next verse. And here, this is really paying homage to compassion that takes sort of reality or dharma as its object, as we will see here. So really, this is looking at the impermanence of sentient beings or recognizing them as being impermanent and thereby giving rise to compassion. So it says, beings are like reflections of the moon in rippling water, seeing them as fleeting and as devoid of intrinsic nature. And then the rest of the verse reads, the bodhisattva's mind falls under compassion's sway, yearning to set free every transmigrating being. So here, in the way that like when you have a reflection of the moon on water and that water is being blown by the wind, that reflection is going to ripple. It's sort of constantly changing. So too, sentient beings are changing moment to moment. I mean, we really, we have this sense that like, oh, I'm here. We might even think like I'm alive, sort of I'm alive from my own power. But really, when we think about this in any real way, we can see that being alive requires all kinds of causes and conditions. Like just for us to be here, it's not as though we're static and unchanging, but we need to have, well, we have to eat sometimes, we have to drink, we have to breathe, our heart needs to beat. We have to have all of the kind of external elements as well as internal elements, and we are dependent upon these various things. It's not as though being alive is just sort of this static static state, but rather it is the gathering, the coming together of all kinds of various causes and conditions. And so often we think about like, wow, look at these incredible machines that humans can build. They build these computers and all of these things. But look at our body as an incredible machine and all of the kinds of things that have to be working for us to even be alive. So just as it is to be alive as a human, we have to have all kinds of causes and conditions for that to be. We are impermanent. And constantly kind of changing. If we understand that well, then really we can give rise to compassion for these beings who are grasping so tightly at a sense of permanence. They hold to their being this kind of a self, a real stable, permanent self, and engage in all kinds of bad karma because of it. So here, this is something that is very helpful for us to generate compassion towards sentient beings. And there is a verse from Aryadeva's 400 that describes like when we talk about someone being alive, it's really nothing more than a series of mental moments. Like we don't have this awareness of it. We hold that like, well, I'm the same person as I was, 1 second ago. But really, it is the case that we are dependent upon a constant flux of causes and conditions, just sort of like a reflection of the moon rippling in water. So here, recognizing beings as impermanent and then giving rise to compassion for them based upon that is the meaning of the second verse.
Maranzo melonal patan tete tibiro tende tatan miro tende tichu pe shena saburde tiche riro chendo o samsarashi ngone yimbe sori sorgudo tase o ti de kasa sunye da ngone yimbe da shuna ga sunye de da ngone de mare da ngone yimbe na shi tong gu ara rangshin ji tong bare da rangshin ji tong bare ina da rangshin de ngone yimbe da tong gu ra Maranzo melonal tane sosupajoti tongone yimbe soreji tongdegerwa tongdengone de maro kote ina ojine shora rangshingi tongba rangune tuba naya rangune tuba matuba rangi ngoyo yose ko korangi wangi yose ngarangi yoto sige soreche tongi yorde ko korangi yo mare bad mangboji chojin duine ina ngazo le fa chik so shege mato chige Kurangene rangone yona diresi chiglin zugu tsuksari chikora. Rangone yona ranganto yona. Kawa yosu diresi ere tsuktos tiyo mare. Shenda jin mida shine di suru di chichi rida sa lakwa ne chi she zugre tsu tongle tsu chi mato shenke yo mara. Ti ko midi reda yo mara. Kangbari shine tawa chikbarwa. Ti indu kai sura. Rangone tuwa rangshinki rangi ngoyo yoba. 아주 다we 송게데 다왕묘기 랑신이 바나야 ter마두바 나시 마란조야 다다 나시 가리나 삼사 라와도 투바시 나야 라모네 투바데 똥바데 삼네 진짜 삼르탄데 따심비에데 저게 대하고 구메도아 삼테 하마고네 단다 저 라와 투반지 에네치 다와 동해를 지던다를 주제 여행에 반담데 살도데 거라 Nesungone de Medabo Yimbata, Ramune Meva Yabuja Hakona, Tende Samlu Shukchimbuda, Ra Shenla Tawachi, Atachi Shibuji, Mrs. Kitchen Bushibuchi Sege, Tendejiko, Natachi Omara. O Titandolia, Ranshiji Mevas, Tatunda, Simjan Samla Mibe Niji said, Simjan Tunga Nezukona Samla, any Niji Ketela, Simjan Samla Mibe Nijira. Ne chola mibe niji suru simbyen mida bada. Rangya tube tsayi tongpa segre tate yore yoye. Ndegi chule. Mida ba. Kechi kin jikbe rangshin jengi chue yinba. Yana pungbu la, pungbu song ala matu ba rangi sungto meba. Rangya tube tsayi ki tami sero, tende sero. Ade dure. Tende tongwa la tene ne. Niji kechi wardo, Tela chola me ben yi suda. Pungbi cho samla. Pungbi cho samla tene tapa samla sam. Oh, tende samla ta ate soda. Chola me ben yi. Mikwa me bala me ben yi. Oh, mi me. Ta tongba ni de tende. Simje rang shin ji tongba thong ne rang shin ji tuba na ya. Rang shin ji tuba tongba thong ya ko ne ani ni ji ke chora. Simje keji ke jigbe me da ba yi ya. Ko tang jing gi wang ge. Ani lesa ne do te chora. Ho te samla ko ne. Ani ni ji ke chora. Chola me ben yi. Simje samla me ben yi. Chola me ben yi. Mikwa me bala me ben yi. Oh, te shio to ya te chuna.
So, here, again, beings are like reflections of the moon in rippling water. And so the first, seeing them as fleeting is really recognizing them as impermanent. And then we have, and as devoid of intrinsic nature. So here, although like when we see something like the reflection of a moon in water, it looks like a real moon. It appears as like the moon, but it lacks existence as such. So here, this is the kind of compassion that takes, we could say, no referent as its object. So we have the kind of compassion for sentient beings that observes them as observes their suffering, observes their impermanence, and then here really looking at how phenomena appear to us as though they exist in and of their own right, from their own side. If it were the case that with the I, the person, that were true, that there was some sort of I that existed in and of itself, independently, autonomously, we should be able to point to it, like point it out. Okay, right there, this is it. But when one investigates in that way, you can't find such an I that exists in and of itself, in its own right, from its own side. So this is like a house or any other kind of object that we might take. It seems that it appears as though it is substantial, like existent in and of itself, truly existent, but doesn't actually exist in that way. So here, the self, the I, they appear to exist independently, autonomously, kind of not dependent or contingent upon anything else. But it is the case that they lack that kind of inherent existence. So here, there is the kind of compassion that takes phenomena as its object is often said. So this is looking at sentient beings as, and again, when we are able to view them in this way, when we hold something to have that kind of like inherent, true, real existence, it becomes like very serious for us, very important. And when we break that down, we can see that it doesn't actually exist in the way that we were holding it to. So there is the kind of compassion that looks at suffering sentient beings, as we saw in the verse above, verse 3. And then there is the kind of compassion for sentient beings that looks at, here it's translated as phenomenal reality or as observing phenomena, recognizing that there is no self-sufficient, substantially existent kind of a person. There is no permanent person, but rather they are momentary, changing moment to moment to moment. And then there is the kind of compassion that is described as non-observable or unobservable sort of compassion, which is recognizing that although sentient beings appear as inherently existent, recognizing that they lack that kind of existence is then the kind of compassion that takes no reference as its object or has no referent point, one could say.
Oh yeah, Ramasa. Draw you a shoe down the water, you don't rush in it. Java Sabbath, some gun draw number two as you need you want to chill. Oh, Tenitira. Oh, 10 years simple get on the shield. Tipo don't matter. True the way. Oh, I'm tender to say. That turned out good. I'm June. And the Simjan. Tambutoma, the little source of agent not on the summer tangura. Means you summer tandu. Oh, just summer time, so tender. Toma Mevane, Satanda Podo, Tunga, Tanda, Maubana, Tendino, de Gere, some. And it is to do some little semblance of several chigra. To get a trend and one that you tell you about to tell with the Samsa. Maubana, Kasakala, Capone, with the Samsa, the Stan Squara. Oh, gee, I was a kiss on a nation, Jashanda. 남중아 주세요. 소소 파마가 좀 심지어 상말과 고메레 되어라. 어디 군비고 동해진 나르 짱짱한 삼로도 안에 네 심지어는 매변이 지지지도 심지어 삼라 매변이 지세도 아니 심지어 메다 보다 텐데이나 단다 고 땅진 경하게 아니 삼로 친지로고네 소소 딱반 주제 또 대시와라 텐데 삼로고 아니 동해진 나르 삼로도 안에 로 비니 지게 되려 출람 매변이 지세 다들 줄레니가 메다 봐 또 시럽이 심배권에 심지어는 지켜와 그래 심지어 랑자토베 세외지 동바 동해권에 지켜와 뒤에서 그래 랑자토베스도 동반일에 또서 라를 지워라 근데 소소 송아디 풍부 송아라 마드바 송에 지워 말와 나 세치여 된 건지 제가 그래도 야나 미션다 단데 속보라질 때내내 지지레서 오라 야나 소속에 초아를 붙일 때는 어가 기부도 가 기부면도 어가 나그도 세르지 질레 다시 질레 때는 봐 따고라 라니 무슨 최신지 무슨 마도 코란 데르스 태가 가둘 무슨 해지 메도 그 가두 란게토 버지요나 시안라 떠진 될 메고 봐 코란 찍고 용 토버지요나 그 데르스 주고 조사르지 거라 란게토 베세베스도 디호마로 디 풍부 은진치도 풍부를 지다 지야나 소보다 아주 민들지 돈 어디지를 소볼 땐다 그라 알아답지나 모더르지나 지 수지 돈 어디지를 샤섬 마인게지 차네 텔레텐 파타고도 어디서도 그 랑게토 라니 송아 최신 송아라 마트바 송도 여봤다 보지 간사 코란 송아 풍부라 소바 간사 마인베 덕시험 처시지 송아라 또 말고 봐 코란지 철주 예배 소리시 시작도 근데 매바 또 랑게토베 자유지 담에서기도 근데 또 시럽지 심배권에 니지케야 돼 풍부 최삼라 미베 심제시마도 랑게토베 심제시 요마레 매나야 단다든데 여반진에 레산에 코아코데도 삼자 근데 삼다야 들어 어때도 이래 다음에 산소에 솔로 두티르바 어때도 야 어디서다 아니 저한테는 세상에 저한테는 요새서
So here, this is really the verse that we are going to go through here, verse 4. And so to begin with, how to generate compassion for other sentient beings who are in this kind of suffering situation is to first think of our own suffering, how since beginningless time, we have been propelled by our ignorance to continue to take rebirths, to take up these appropriated aggregates. And we feel like we need to be freed of this. No matter what it might take, we want to get out of this entire cycle of samsara's suffering. And so to then extrapolate that to others, we see that, well, I am in this situation, but so too are all other mother sentient beings, all these other sentient beings who have acted as like my mothers and fathers. And so looking at their suffering, then we have the kind of compassion that observes merely sentient beings, is usually how it's translated, because it's really looking at the kind of suffering that they are experiencing and feeling a sense of compassion. And then there is the kind of compassion that one can generate based upon, again, compassion observing phenomena in the sense of, well, sentient beings grasp at some kind of permanence. And this, look at the way that they suffer due to their grasping at things as being permanent, when they are really moment to moment. They are momentarily disintegrating and changing, and yet they are holding to this thing as being like stable and lasting. Or also we could say, and this is more coarse than the most subtle sort of understanding of emptiness, but recognizing how sentient beings, they grasp at some sort of self-sufficient, substantially existent self. Now, usually when we think about how do we designate an I, it's on the basis of like one of the aggregates, right? We see someone and we say, oh, there's that person. Or we are talking about the sort of feeling that we had or the thought that we had. So there is some particular basis of designation, and you are designating this I in dependence upon that. Now, this sense of a self-sufficient, substantially existent I is something that is not dependent or contingent upon anything else. selves. Like it would be as if there were an I that existed independent of the various aggregates, as though we could identify a person without having to, say, see their form or think about their mind and so forth. And so this kind of sense of there being something that could set itself up, like that it appears without being dependent or contingent upon any basis of designation, and seeing that beings holding to an I that exists like that, they create this suffering situation for themselves. And so here, these are the different kinds of levels of developing compassion for sentient beings based upon either looking at just their suffering, their kind of qualities of impermanence and so forth, and finally their lack of any kind of intrinsic inherent existence. So I think that's the verse that we are going through, and then we will open it up for question and answer. I may ask if Gala Rinpoche could help on asking questions. I don't know how well I'll be able to hear, but
yeah, sure.
yeah, any questions that you might have.
You can ask in English so that Katina will translate. Okay. So we have four specific questions.
Yeah,
Okay. So I'll just do them in the order I have here. For the first one is guidance on preparing for death. Katina, can you hear what the Venerable is asking?
Yeah, they might need to speak up a little bit.
Okay. Okay, so the first question, just to invite again Rinpoche to speak about preparing for death. This is especially because some of our nuns are now now becoming old. We've practiced for a long time, and now as we really look at death in front of us, what would Rinpoche recommend that we focus on the most?
아니, yeah. 콘소기 아니 금발라 다 아니 카시 다 겐고 차요르와 만서 뭔가 게기레르와 아니 치게 라모기 갑수 다 믹세기 칼로 나야 유베 다 치와 치게 라모기 갑수 다 카레 조 카레레스 다 키랑기 랍자 세나민도 다 치와라 차치 체페 체두 다 치게 라모기 갑수 카레 삼로 당거래 카레 또 야 라레 칸제스 차치 체고레스 다 nganso gengo jabo chana 다 치와디 뉴르 jabo drogres 아니 케체슈 쏘다 카레 삼로 당거레스
야야. 찍으라도 안되셔. 야야. 다시도 거를 삼을 땅 그랬잖아. 최 남경아도 최 생계지 내려 봐. 아니 곰발이 여기 남균의 최 생계지나. 아니 거랑 삼을 가르 땅 그랬잖아. 남주 삼을 가르 땅 그나 때도 잠바다 닝지 장주고 셈 동반이라 공부요나 어때 삼을 땅 그라. 기회 삼을 찍은 거네 반도에 삼을 땅 그라. 삼롱감자치 소소 롱주다 주류다 때도 강가를 신차 삼을마다 때도 강가 방에네 삼 남기네 삼을 땅이 지라 대외 추제래 삼 이마지 샤는 로에 가가래 삼사 삼을 땅이 와라 대외 추제라 제 삼을 땅에 신자 계사가 유투도 삼을 땅이 매라 공도사에 땅 차도 땅 때도 삼을 땅이 와 마라 남경아주 개와로 가래 지기 유나야 chiga lamulya nga ga nyamli chinge ne koraso nga ga samul tanda chiware chirim tozu panje sachule tim chumele te tozu kanga namgune yabu samul tanga yune tezu sheche tezu tensu chegora ate namgune tinde ke samul tanga meche chambada nyeje chanju sem jamru rab tinde samul tanga yune teran samul tanga gora ke soso kumshi yosa te samul tanga thura 전다데 고 시갈람을 계획안에 시유튜브 시오라 삼로 셴다 감다 마고 하셔 근데 나란저 파이나 코란리아 samba ma tu chu chu yo ma ra Quran samba kare ka ne tin na shi che chu gur ma to che tin de shanda ko sembe mi ki ba so tin de shi yo ma Quran de ba na shi kan ga kare chen de ti che chu gur a ale ti che lam na
Here, at the time of death, I mean, for those who have been living a kind of Dharma life, as you in the nunnery have, whatever kind of virtuous attitude, love, compassion, whatever it is that you have developed over the course of your practice, really trying to keep that mind at the time of death is really important. So one wants to die in the state of a virtuous mind, not with any kind of fear or anxiety or any sort of attachment. I mean, we are preparing by recognizing that we're going to have to part from all of these things, whatever possessions we have, whatever friends and family, even our own body. And so by thinking about those things regularly, that we have to part with these, we are going to be separated from these things, then when we get to that point of dying, there won't be that sort of clinging to the sort of object of this life, whether it's our body, our possessions, our friends, whatever it might be. And then again, whatever kind of virtuous activity, virtuous minds you've developed in the course of life, dying within that state is really most important. If you are practitioners of the mantrayana and are able to do the kind of have throughout the course of your life meditated on the stages of the dissolution at the time of death, of like earth into water and water into fire and so forth, to be able to recall that and do that at the time of death would be really excellent. But whatever kind of attitude, whether it's refuge or whether it's love, compassion, this dying within that kind of state of mind is really important. And for the people that are around, that are attending to this person, it's important to let them sort of guide the process, to not disturb the person who is passing away, that they are allowed to have things how they might want it, and to make sure that we don't create any sort of disturbance of the mind at that time of death.
o tene kan zu ke lo ma da tin de yin na o ta ke ran pe so nam che bu re sa bu da ke ran san je chum de ge so yo de ane chi chu kan ge chang da nyam be ane ka so ta ti ma lam ne de me ra ke ba mang bo chu tim sung ge chi ti chu sang ye kan le ro ti chu sang bo ye be ka la ya ane chi tim re ji so ne pe lo bum da mang bo Sutum Sone Tabale, you made to Zindelia, Rabdu Chone, Sutum Nashi Sombati, and you take and you Mambo Cherry Soda. The end of Personam Chembore, Rabdu Chone, Tendete, Sanjay Temple, Rabdu Chon, Tandabo Church at the Personam Chembore, Keva Mambo, the College, and Keva Sanducilia, Sanjay Temple, Tara, and Pesum, so Makanga Sambo, Capsuliana, Sutum Songam Mambo, or the paint and the younger Omara. Tanda nyingme tuyo rwa, ngone nyingme rwa. O yinde tinte kabliya chutum nachi sunga te zule henyi chaya res, kira peke sambo res. Ne koran ya mewa rewe jikba yonde, ta kira mewa chagi yo mar das. Kira sem di taru chini, lu shenda lanya ga ti chigre, kira molam yabu kyabu, sanje ga tenpa tan jaya, chu nambar tabo shitan jaya. Kyo kunse yonde kundengi sanje chumdende tabi, sanje ga shingam da chu tar sachile, Yeah, Milu Sambuchi, Tobiago Samton say, what in the chill and make a word.
So you should also recognize that you at the Abbey are extremely fortunate, and you have such a great fortune. Some of you are fully ordained nuns, bhikshunis, and someone who in this degenerate time is guarding that kind of ethical conduct is really incredible. The kind of virtue, merit that one is creating by doing that is something that is almost unimaginable. During the time of the Buddha, to hold such ethical conduct was beneficial, but not to the extent that it is now. When we think about this degenerate kind of era. And it is said that to hold just one sort of ethical commitment in this time, holding on to the teachings of the Buddha, even just through one ethical commitment, is so much more powerful than holding a full kind of ethical commitment during the time of a fortunate eon. So you should recognize just how powerful the virtue that you have accumulated is. And it's really important that people die without a sense of fear. Someone might have this feeling of like, I'm going to become non-existent, and being able to talk them through that really they're not becoming non-existent. The mind is becoming more and more and more subtle, and making good prayers to be able to be born in the presence of a Buddha and receive the Buddha's teachings and so forth, or to be in a pure land, to again be able to continue to strive for the state of Buddhahood, free of all faults and developing all good qualities, to make those sorts of prayers, to be able to have a good rebirth and have that kind of confidence in those at the time of death, such that there is no fear, is also important.
tene tende samlo koral chodagi ro ene koral te ka so kerachi nami ta chi kar sure shenja chesa lonje da tende li kera samlo koge mare kera rabdu chungdine te to pa sha ne ti chesa res ro te de da ta kera ene lu shenda yabu ji la ye ti che wo res dakche gi ji ba de ya chu chu mare ta nga me ba cha to samsa ti ten chu chu mara 그런 속보다 가가셔도 밀류 약부질라에 최신계게 최바 약부질 밀류 약부질라에다 진짜게 쳐도 통만 매번에 사셔봐 가라서 띠바 마부여를 대조 강가 만들버려 섬 당한 깨와 침마데 빼쳐 넘버트 버신게 저방게 심지어 마부를 팬통게 지금 인사촌 내 전주 샘상을 당고라 심지어 탐제 같은 쪽동게 진짜질 깨와 쇼 진짜 치우지던 제와 쇼서라 근데 맨날 심지어 망보를 팬 통계지 저 상부질에 도보쇼 삼자 어떤데 삼을 땅고 그래서 시가 남몰이야 어떤데 삼을 땅도 개 삼을 안에 삼발relle체 어 시장감대서 말은 나란서 강가 산제 좀 된데 그 송구도 와 안에 갈서라 저저 랑시를 심대 마시에 소요라 부쇼쇼세 부세대 나란서 강가를 송겨라 부대 보면서 쇼쇼세 심대 마치 쇼 송겨라 내 가서래 이제 탐전에 유래 출신들에서 정말 윤도에서 견학치고 말해서 이제 탐전 유래 출신들 내 매번 유래 다네 내에 봐라 나자면 소보 탄다이나 나자 연구에서 담아들라 내 매매 타네 내 매매 타네 내 봐라 내 매매 타 랑주 타네 개버들 경고되거라 내 매매 타 랑주 저르베 타네 그거들 가가 된들 저르바세도 그 가간데라 내 매매 타 랑주도 저르바라 소 남네 소되는 유래 출신에 소게 담아 치워야 되래서 저저 임바도 고랑시에 저절이야 고 가르소래 지바제 셈데체 요 말에 고라 정말 요랑시에서 어디 가서래 사바 건지 탄제체 통본 남제 타동제 네베 타마토 기회 타마 지와에 상매랑시에서 다 깨완될 때네 신의 깨와 상부질랑게 인삼 미베 상부지 로 셈제 탐제가 더 뚝통게시 깨와렘바 쇼스 말람게 삼바 상부강에 대해서 소거라. 근데 라브나 좀 맞아야.
So here, then again, it's important for the person who is dying to not be attached to various things, not be within the sort of proximity of objects of attachment. Now, you living in a nunnery have probably largely given up the kind of attachment to possessions and family and so forth. But this is important, again, not that to not have something that one is sort of clinging to. And it is also important not to have this feeling of like annihilation or being becoming totally non-existent. Again, although one is giving up this body and the consciousness is becoming more and more subtle, you are going to take on another form. And so really thinking about that, thinking, may I take up a form that in which I can be of great benefit to others? May I take such a birth that I am able to effectuate a great benefit for others? others. So rather than having this thought of like, I'm going to become non-existent, remembering that one is going to take a rebirth and making that be something positive. Again, you want to be in a good state of mind, something that is sort of relaxed and virtuous and calm without this kind of anxiety. The Buddha, sort of speaking to us as like his children, has said sort of like there's a passage which basically says like, son or child, like, come here, don't be afraid. Everything is of the nature such that it changes. When we are without illness, the end of that is getting sick, right? Although we might accumulate a great deal of wealth, the end of that is loss. And although we are alive, the end of that is death. This is just the nature of things. So rather than feel anxious or feel worried about it, we should recognize that this is just how things are. As the famous sort of set of lines, I won't maybe get all of them, but the end of birth is death, the end of accumulation is loss, the end of meeting is separation, and so forth, that this is the nature of things. And so here, again, feeling a kind of positive, virtuous attitude and making a prayer that one is able to gain a good form, to be able to continue to pursue the Buddha's teachings and be of benefit to others. This is really making that sort of prayer, that kind of aspiration and positive intent at the time of death is quite important.
전에 람나야 고기다. 고 가서래 계란 추응하라도 참아 첸디다. 겨와 토마 매번에 뒷밥에 망보 사요래세. 저저 강가 뒷밥 탐을 마디래 삼. 전에 뒷발이야 여바쳐고래세. 여바쳐베 얘나 마디버래 대 너르래 삼사 삼을 땅이나 계란 뒷밥 다르래. 뒷밥 연대데 다야 여버더라. 여바쳐는 다야 여버더라. 어디인데 자꾸 겨 통만 매번에 젤라 차와라 소베 뒷밥 망보 제거래 첸디 쳔베. 저저 강가 마디버래 삼 샤바치기 삼 상계 초주 삼계인데 샤바치기 삼 마디버래 상계바천 그래다. 마디버래서 샤바치기 삼 첸데레 계란 랍도 중어래 대 쳔베. 겨와 망보래 계란 겨와 빼 망보 사요래세. 겨와 망보리야 겨와 빼 망보 사요래세. 저저 참아 샤바텔레 테네 마음바다 계란 심제 망보 등 툭툭게 겨와 상보 와 상계지 고반 톱통게 타로 톱통게 텐데지 제 통계기 겨와랑 바쇼 삼삼몰람 자고래세 겨와라 랑게 겨와라 제수기란 제 첸데라 제 겨와가 빼 겨와만 보사요래 대저 강가리 봐 가와 꼼네 대저 라테네 네 대부 겨와 상부실련 토바쇼세 몰람 잠네 오요라 진짜 아니 초다게 되게 저라 시라 마모셔는 거라 순도그라 거라 나와도 저 뇨뇨뇨뇨 시에네티 시에네하고래 오야
So, in this life and in our countless previous lives, we have accumulated so much non-virtue and really generating a sense of regret for that, recognizing that it's not okay and feeling a kind of regret that leads us to purify that. This is something that is really important. Again, the one sort of quality of non-virtues is that they can be purified. So like those that we have done in this life, we should feel this kind of sense of regret and make a pledge. I'm not going to do this again in the future. So really acknowledging, feeling regret for our non-virtues and doing purification is something that is really important. And as well, it is important to recognize, especially you who have lived as nuns now, that you have accumulated a great deal of virtue. I mean, to have even taken up this kind of life shows that you accumulated a great deal of virtue in the past. It's something that's almost immeasurable. And so taking the kind of time to, at the time of death, say that all of that virtue, I'm going to dedicate that, put that toward being able to take rebirth in a way that I can be of benefit to others, really feeling a sense of joy in the virtues that one has accumulated and wanting that to be sort of channeled into taking a rebirth in which one can continue to pursue this Buddhist path or continue to be of great benefit to others. This is something that is important as well. Now, we don't want to be like too verbose or too wordy at the time of someone's death as they are going, but really sort of keep in mind the essential kind of points.
되니까 잠도 마시면 제세로. 상계 좀 된대리 겹겨원에 철업 탐제도 겹던 바보 나무로나 세켜라서 말았다세. 대승배 최대 다른 챈들의 최대단 제서 마음바나 상계기 승배 최대 아무쪽에서 철을 겹서 채워삼. 잠경원에도 최대인삼. 대체신도 중경의 초주 장주선보다 강가트 상마탐절이야. 네, 최주배 로바나로나 스트로스 로나로나 스 짬도들 마시비시네 야보다. 대장자 삼을 당선다 되라. 산절을 껴서 철을 껴서 kin들을 껴서 채워서 산계기 껴안에 스럽 탐제를 겹던 바보 나로나 스 철을 껴서 채워서도 산계가 송배 철을 서와 bomba 철을 탐바투바 최대주 삼마대 아니 나 경경의 청원에 대해서 철을 겹선도 요사 kin들을 껴서 채워서 짬도들 마치비시 대제 대통나 안에 계획 안에 시표라 계획 삼령 안에 시표나네 루치를 계획에 듣고 다 지어라 시간 남은 뺏게 해버려 삼바 계획 삼을 깨야 돼 공도라부터 삼바 계획 삼을 깨나는 게서 계획 주도한지 보여라 어때 초다게 되게 제제 내가 거랑 삼을 다다게 되게 지주라 야야 되게
Here, just one more thing to mention is to really, again, you should sort of pay attention to what's going on for the person who is passing. And one of the more important things is to recall refuge, to not forget refuge. Really, refuge in the Buddha as the teacher, and the Dharma as the actual refuge, and then the Sangha as those who are helpers along the path. And make these kinds of prayers, aspirations, that in the future you might be able to meet with the Buddha's teachings again, that you might be surrounded by those who are practicing likewise, and so forth, and recognizing that really the Dharma is the actual refuge, wanting to meet that again in the future, holding in mind this sense of refuge at the time of death. Even that is just sufficient, like thinking that I seek protection in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, and really recognizing that one's genuine actual refuge is in the Dharma, in basically our own practice of refraining from harming others and doing as much as we can to benefit others. So if one is able to have such a mind, any kind of virtuous mind at the time of death, that is seen that it is certain that we will go to a good rebirth. So really the kind of mind right at the time of dying is something that is very important, and you can kind of look at the individual to find what is the right thing to do. Yeah, if you've got more questions, please.
Yeah, so the second question is just this. The Lamrim has almost nothing about subtle impermanence actually in the teachings or in the meditations. And yet, when we look at meditating on dependent arising and then also on emptiness, it must have a very important role, this reflection on subtle impermanence as well. So my question for again Rinpoche is to think about how to bring meditation on subtle impermanence. Is it helpful to bring meditation on subtle impermanence into reflection on these two of dependent arising and emptiness, and suggestions for how that could be done or should be done?
The Lamrim gi kapsu chitang mitakpa tramo korla shetra she yomare mitakpa tramo. Mitakpa
Ale metaba trambe kol serve.
Sundari.
Metaba trambe kol ya. Ne? Je pengira metaba trambe jimje samle tangura. Ganjo metaba sede keching ma shera. Kechi le judo de samle tangura. kechi jura. Oh, the Karsoda. Taking out to Sambana Shiche Kunjuan Rotan to Lute. She Joan Nagi Sobu Netala Soba Tetu Samalton and Juan to Yara. Then over Samatam de Kudan Kelatan and Kigiore says the wa. Kudan Kelatan and Kibare said to Tamidaba Tamushegura Kotuna. Kudan Kelatan and Tanda Pa Kigi Kongo to Tekuyora. You want to go into which we are. Kong over time to Chunam Tam Julie Chora. Medaba in the Ranga Kivich. Kudan Kangi on the Koki resident. Kujinchi Kesar the Tabaji take Mara Konjuan to do Kujin to Chiora. Medaba Yabo Samatana. And the Tunga to do some court with it. Meta, Jim Metale Tunga. Juan to the Tanda Yavachina Karina Juan to Yora. Tanda Person of watching and Juan to Yora. The watching a Tewatoya Tapsi Chidi, Joachini, Chihuahua, the Mabachagora. Teaching medale Tungese. Qua delia, Coletta, Yumabawagi, Kene, Kechi, Medaba Yende. Joaching Medaba Yende, Leta Yumabawagi, called Kyoata Lamba de Sigora. In the Leta Yumabawagi, Kyola, Chiyatelia, Joachine. 동해지 마다 야야마라 티친 메달에 동해 송구다 티친 메달에 동해는 다음에서 동해가 인도 레다 녀면 바왕게 샤마창인데 네 다음에 바라에 다체 야야마라 어디 메다바데 패케션 보래 메다발에 때네 네 동해와 그래서 야부 삼을 거도 그래 조안도에 돼 조안도에 인베네 소소 라와체네 네 다치 메바데 하고도네 Kumbungan Juan to the Conjuan to Esidemato, Rangwene Rangshingi to Vasiona, Takpa to Gora, Rawa to the Rangshingi to the Rangango to the Sulamadu Vasicura. Oh, the descendant, Tombany Toilet Pengiora. Yeah. You know?
No. So here, thinking about impermanence in the sense of not just sort of being, in a course way, being dependent on causes and conditions, but as a momentary, this is really an important kind of contemplation. We often look at it in the context of thinking about impermanence helps us to think about suffering, which in turn helps us to think about selflessness. And so here, when we first sort of look at how often all things are generated from causes and conditions, in the sense that they are occasional, right? When their causes are there, they come about and not otherwise. And so looking at them sort of being occasional in that way or dependent upon various causes and conditions, this can lead us to an understanding of suffering. However great it might be, whatever excellent thing we might have, it is impermanent. It is going to change. It is not going to remain. And it's not just that it is dependent upon those causes and conditions, but really that it's changing moment to moment to moment. And so when we are able to recognize that these things are sort of in the nature of suffering because they are impermanent, then that helps us to in turn understand their selflessness, that they don't have the kind of autonomy. Like these things don't have the ability to stay as we might want them to stay. Like we think that, oh, well, if this thing is existent in and of itself, in and of its own right, then it should have that kind of independence, autonomy, to be totally not dependent upon causes and conditions. But so thinking about impermanence is something that is really crucial in this way of thinking about both suffering and then eventually leading into the understanding of selflessness or emptiness.
Judan Gale Tenny Kiri resident, Medava Tamahako to Villa. Judan Gale Tenny Kiri resident. Let on your mood change, Shama change Metaba Rese. Quaba Vinici Tamjera. Jason Daco, Tunga Rese. Tunga in a social round about Tunga Shama change in a round of Consage Cavallo to the Stame. Go to Villa. Yeah, any degree. What did you so many? Yeah, Josh and that you said.
No, no. So here, really understanding the axiom that all compounded phenomena are impermanent, and impermanent in the sense of being dependent upon causes and conditions. In this particular case, our contaminated appropriated aggregates are impermanent, are dependent upon the causes of karma and the afflictions. And when we can come to recognize them as such, and sort of first their suffering nature, and then based upon that can come to understand their being selfless and empty and so forth.
Yeah, I need to question that. Oh, yeah.
So I wanted to know, whether the difference, sonam gewa le sangpo je ki kepar tang ta chu kangda yinam, sonam sokpa sheba kang yinam, sonam tang gewa shebe kedun tel she tang mindrawa kaki kebar kang yinam, ya gechu la laki.
I think you ask in English so that she will translate.
So the difference between merit, sonam, and virtue, and then like good karma, what is the difference? And also, what is accumulation of merit? How do you understand this?
Chula chua kosong
Yeah, the
Oh, do got quick.
sonam tang gewa tang gewe le yanga le sangbo ki kepa karayores.
Sonam che.
Sonam
Le.
gewa what was the third one that you said?
Sonam gewa good karma, so gewele.
Sonam
Sonam gewa
kewa
gewele.
kewe le.
Gewele.
Oh, le, this. Sonam kewa kewe le. Karu sonam kewa yore se. Sonam sonati namju chita kewa kangale kochori ine. Sonam dengam kewe le chera. Debe kamge. Mida halan dengam mida hala kechi le yorwa. Mida hala kechi mikiwa chupa kewa chupa le soba. Otele ka sonam segra. Sonam dengam kewe le se. Sonam ye. Sonam maimbe le se nyawa da yeda tanto to kechi le. Dengam genge sosum le kechi kyudela. Sonam maimbe le segra. Sonam jile sonam maimbe le. Miwe le se le sum segra. Sunam jele, sunam mai bele, miyu le sum shegra. Sunam mai bele, sudu tikbati, sosum le kichi kyudere. Nyawa yidata le kichi. Letere. Sunam jele, sun debe lada miliki. Dungam be lada miliki. Miyu le, sede samden tangbo ta, sungmi da haliki ete. Tingizi komne, teta tele kichi ge, tingizi komne. Samden tangbo, shi, Nieto someday you be thinking come Chanel Hado come the teleke less I sure. Tell a meal less. Someday Tambu Lele Kichi things the committee. Someday Tambu only kicker Mato Shandal care your mother. Oh, tell Niba in Niba Sumba Sumba Sumi Namgata Namshita. Things they come there. Namgatabu come Tende Shaji come the Aki less sure. Tell a meal less. How to kill a shadow to check your mother. Sunam jile sudu tere. Chita sunam mai bele, sunam jile, sunam mai bele, meyo le sum shebe, sunam jile sede. Sunam mai bele sene nge sum le keçile. Sunam jile sene debe la da mele keçile. Meyo le sene suda summe le keçile. O tichilam na tambo.
Gewa dang sonam chitang kepa due. Sonam dang gewa.
Oh, yeah, alle tambo tichilab da.
Lo.
Meyo sunam mai bele sene nge son le keçile. Sunam jile suna le sum shaya ka sunam jile sayate bebe lada milik kichik le tele sigrese. Chitan ko kewale sunam sa sigi wara.
Not at all.
Le sum shebe kapji sunam jile sayate tele sigrese. Sunam mebele tele sigrese. Chitan kewale sunam sa gura se love ge wara. Oh yeah.
So here, first, the term sonam or merit, really for the most part, refers to virtuous karmas, particularly virtuous karma that leads to birth in the desire realm as a human or a god. So in general, when we talk about karma, we can talk about the three types of meritorious karma, non-meritorious karma, and invariable karma. So meritorious karma would be those virtuous, those positive actions that lead to taking rebirth in the desire realm as a human or a god. Non-meritorious karma would be those that act as a cause of taking rebirth in the lower realms as an animal, a hungry ghost, or a hell being. And then there are those invariable or sort of unmoving, wherein these are the causes that lead to the karmas, the causes that lead to taking rebirth within the four concentrations or the formless realms, based upon developing meditative stabilization. So when you develop the kind of cause that leads to rebirth in the second concentration, it's only going to lead there. It's invariable, it's unmoving. And so, or like for infinite space or infinite consciousness, whatever it might be within the formless realm. So here, in general, when we talk about accumulating merit, we are talking about virtues, accumulating or engaging in virtues, and those virtuous karmas are things that will lead to rebirth within the sort of happier destinies as a human or a god.
Chitan ko kiwe le to zole sunam jile se shakdwa. Le tanda nga zunde sunam jile se de. Le sum du chiwe sunam jile te dan kiwe le suna. Musum sigra achanyi bachana. Le sum du chiwe sunam jile yina kiwa yin kure. Kiwa yina sunam le sum du chiwe sunam jile yin kumarwa. Sudan sumi le kichi kiwe le to so yungura.
So here in general, when we are talking about virtuous karma, and then meritorious karma, we could say these two terms, virtue and merit, are like, and I'm sorry, are like musum, are there is that which is both, and then there is so we have meritorious karma that is virtuous karma, and then there are those virtuous, we would say in general terms, virtuous karmas, which are not meritorious karmas, in that they are like the invariable karma that one has accumulated to be born in the second or whatever kind of concentration. So there are virtues which are not merits in the sense of those merits in the three types of karma.
수군들지기 교육소들을 손남지 소세라. 이시주구를 소버 셈비 빵바던 똑배 연대기 교육소들이야 이시기 소세도. 치드네 구송구도 송도 또 연대 주시들 손남지 소세야 대시도. 손남이 시 레주에 담바코니 토바쇼세도. 수군들지기 개와도들 손남지래서 손남지 소세라. 추군급제기 레터줄라 이시기 소세트인데 제제 용도도 자 손남 세대 급리 개발에 주초도 급리 때니 탑기차 저줄이야 손남지 소스텔에 손남세기도.
So then there is the sort of merit in the context of the accumulation of merit and versus the accumulation of wisdom. So in that context, then we would say that the accumulation of merit is that which acts as a cause for accomplishing the form body of a Buddha. So those kinds of methods, those activities that one engages in, from engaging in generosity and ethics and so forth, all the way say whatever it is that acts as a cause for accomplishing that form body of a Buddha then is the accumulation of merit, whereas the accumulation of wisdom are those that that act toward that go toward the cause of accomplishing the truth body, the Dharmakaya of a Buddha. So here we could have something that is virtuous that would not be part of the accumulation of merit, in that it falls into the sort of wisdom side. And the distinction made in terms of those two accumulations is whether it acts primarily as a cause for the form body or for the truth body.
Oh yeah, that's true. You're right.
Last question, and this is from Venerable Damcho, so I'll need to read it. Yeah. If I can. She's asking why, or is it important, so it's either or, that as a non-Buddhist monastic, we learn the 5 great treatises. Oh, sorry, non-Tibetan monastics. Let me try this again. Let's try this again. Whether or why it is important that as non-Tibetan monastics, we learn the 5 great treatises in the traditional Tibetan curriculum.
Like of Maitreya, sorry, or are we talking about
Yeah, the classic, I believe what she's saying is the 5 great treatises that are taught in the monastic universities. For a Western monastic, learning in English, putting energy into 5 great treatises is that important in this life, because as an aside, I know that for like her translation effort she's been directed to translate more for things that are immediately applicable in the Vinaya rather than going into the more detailed stories of Vinaya in the deep past, right? That's for another generation. But right now we need to be developing the material that can be practiced right now by English-speaking people. So her question is about why it is important, would be important for an American or a Western monastic to train in the 5 great treatises in this life, in Tibetan, in general, but a non-Tibetan, non in the Tibetan education system monastic, maybe that's more accurate. Someone, a Western monastic who is not in the Tibetan tradition education system, how important or why it would be important to study those 5 great treatises. Does that make sense?
Yeah. La so gen la ani namgyun chazang la ta lobjong chetang chi gyores ra jamgun bungde nga rabo shung chambo nga lobjong che gyores ra chazang la
Kare nga ke lobchong.
shung chambo nga 남긴 슝첨보 요래와 차상 낭라 롭종 체사 쏘 잡고 슝첨모래와
lobchong cheta.
다 차상라 롭종 체당 지교래 스키네 간소 지기하기 미예나 다 콘소 아니 금바지 요래스 아니 파게 배쳤잖아 디 롭종 체 개첨보래베스 다 간소 지기하기 미 잡고 예나 아니 트라파 예나 다 푸베기 차창 낭신 롭종 체고르베 니 케쳔보르베스
이제 매제 제고를 배서 그래. 그래서는 벌을 제가
슝쳔모 딘소 롭종 체 니 케쳔보르베스
흉체모 lobchong che서 그래.
라레 미 지기하기 미예나
그래.
아니 트라파다 아니 금발라 콘소 아니 금발라 슈게로아
그래.
아니 파게 디 롭종 체사 소라고 징고르베 양아 간속이 디스 기루아 드로고레스
다살 lobchong 나시 체크뱅 해봐요 말와. 다살이네 고타 셋만 부터 지든지 셰셔라. 어때 고 지단 다세당 빼제티 개개의 마티 소소하고 제 안에때 독반다고요 나는 빼제당게 망보 요즘 식실이 좋아지 독바세 된다 다세당에 대한 거라 te tuwa tini de kale tu te kare se tinte sendu lopson chetan terwa te trasali ya mambu che ne tso chu tuwa tini mambu che tsoba tsuya de mambu tsuya sharwa o tiri mato inji miji te tsoba tsuya trasali na shi tinte che kuwe ngeba yo marwa tanda de kare se ni shung chimi tanda de shengura nyangura tatila tokcho che de yogura tuwa tini che de yogura tuwa tini che de shendali chi na digre kura nampa Chua Trillion Chen today. Oh, Reglam de Tos, Yona Yaburwa. Tasa Nation Gishukchimbu Mambu Manaya. Reglam come much upset that the Kun did do it, and the Kun did do it, the Kun did do it, said the Kora. The Koras in the Sanjay Ganzutin Donald Yogua. Kasa Ribakadak in the Zuber. Tomba Shiva Kyawa maybe Mishipa and draw Kamjurba. Teta tujing a tapsu da riba jada kine zubar jese sungdwa ribe kone etina shikeno dagam kenam je secha da se no suta la ngai ka la cha kuchir mes takche chi se to ti kugdwa ta trasa na shi pole te yema jagala tinde yo marwa ta se ta je mambu tinde yo marwa je tenge te nyage nye ina tokcho ina pasu tokpa chere che chi kare stuwa tilin che tinde che te yora tik pe ke chambure relam te ke chambure shen gore ta ina trasa na shi takse ta tinde ke ko marwa mena digrawa ko yona to yabu shedarte ti mena ya ta chuwa tilin che te chuwa che antele len chabya ti mena ane ta pamshe rizdo sosu ta choba je hako thong mare ting sabu che Kanda chi res la mato yindan hilu ngomate tingmate hako tuku marwa. O te kechebu relam de kwa resa. Trasa nanshin tinte mangbo tsoba kyachambu tinte machuna ya relam de kwa yora. Chua tilin se len kya ti kwa ra. Cheba da tsoba zamba se. Nganzo ti yoba rikwe ne nga nali ya. Tenzi rikwa se chuba, tenzi rikwa. Tengla chuba pangba se tu tenzi rikwa le changsong kudwa. Tengla chuba pangba. Sikla chuba pangba se tu tarikwa kwa ra. Tengla chuba pangba se tu tenzi rikwa se. Shata riklam di mena ane te pamshe re sa mato inbe kyusen kare, mebe kyusen kare shita ting sabun rung marwa. Ting chimba shagira, ngone trane te lepto gore riklam di yo na. Ya te chi lamna di so ya. Na.
지와 데 칼로스나 중간도 베기 난데 나는 슝치 몽아 따워와 이나시 콘솔라 이 페바 마인게 치게게 긴디 쪽파솔라 아니 슝제 가방한테 따요 말 따에 매장한테 따에 슝제 가방한테 따에 개침벌을 해서
가르쳐라.
슝제 가방하죠 와
가병하다 돼.
가방한테 먼저 베베 따워 콘솔에 따에 그가 돼요 말하디 가방한테 따에 개침벌을 해서
다지 다다 되라. 지금 가병아 따야 되세네. 제 가병아 따 통네 따오라. 주매 공부를 전에 거기서 팀송에 대 하고 내 시작자만 디약문도 왔다. 거기서 공부를 타면도 봐. 그놈아 주고도 와. 어때 주관도 다 팀되고 롭션 되기도 와. 어때 시에는 송자의 시에는 다 근데 개분 맞추는 데가 전에도 거라고. 도와주시기 바라. 도와이나 켈로마이나 코란티나 마이 팀비오라 때주다 건주 또 대면도스네 야불랍기도 하티 야보도 와 디디그라 시다 catch면에 송제대 하고는 쪼데 아니 시작하래서 디 멤버 가려는 도 멤버
너 말했지 슝제 가방한테 따에 개침벌을 해서
오케이 첨부대로 송제 가방은 따에다 개침부 따ton다 도와디 송제대 하고는 야보도 와 근데 다 쪼데 오마다 퍼신 남들도 개침부도 와 다 톰나다 강요요 따주라 시다 계시 개보 맞추네 도좀 규유지 차도는 야보로 와 오마다 퍼신다 남들도 수제 아니 도와도 저 규유지 저도 강가 다 톰나 강요요 따고로 와 이제 먼저 trasa 내신파 가심부터 맞추나야 아니 되게
No. So here, unfortunately, I sort of asked the question wrong, but I think the answer is important. So it isn't like definite that we have to follow the kind of model that is set at the monastic institutions that have been rebuilt in India it's not definite that we have to follow that model as Westerners, like in terms of the structure, the way that they debate and do these things. But it really is good to have the kind of ability to have discussion, even if we're not going to do like formal debate with one another, the sort of formalized debate style that they have in Tibetan monasteries was not from India, right? This was something that they created, but this is something that we need to learn the kind of logic and be able to apply that sort of rigor. And it's not just for sort of something that we are doing in order to be able to just say these words and know these things in a kind of intellectual level, but it's to be able to have a really deep integrated knowledge of that. And so to have some ability to have some kind of discussion, like when some sort of qualm comes up or some sort of question, to be able to have that kind of discussion and intellectual sort of pursuit is something that would be very good, even if you don't have the kind of structure that is at the monastery. So then turning more to the actual materials, Genla keeps emphasizing that knowing what is in the major texts that are studied within the monasteries is good, but it isn't something where we necessarily as Westerners are going to be able to have the same level of depth of knowledge. So for example, the nunnery in Taiwan, wherein some of you have taken full ordination, they have a system for studying the Vinaya, because it's important to have real knowledge of what it is that you're taking up in terms of things that you are committing to. In terms of the various texts that are studied within the monastery, I would say that the main important ones, I mean, there's things like the Abhidharma and the Vinaya. The Vinaya, knowing the kind of codes that you are supposed to be holding is important. But the main kind of texts, and again, even if one's not able to go into the same depth, the things that they study with regard to the Madhyamaka and the perfections, those are really important, as well as the like the Pramanavartika and learning valid cognition and those kinds of valid ways of knowing. So even if we don't achieve the sort of depth of learning in terms of being able to go into all of the details of all of those various texts, then the main sort of curriculum that is studied within the monastery, the most important for us as Westerners would be something like the Madhyamaka, the middle way text, the perfection text, the Pramanavartika dealing with valid cognition, and having this kind of back and forth discussion that even if it's not like formal debate, it gives us a chance to really integrate and resolve those kind of understanding.
Tunda tera, shung uma yenada, kare nada, chanju seminada, tomba yenada, mitaba yenada, titi tebache, ti yabuche, reglam kitone hako vachegotoa. Jusen dire sha sama, jusen dire sam, reglam de inji miji kogotoa. Ti yosana ne ti komna hako sana, komna komba tso chegora. Komba tso chegora, ta tasa yenako, shida kom gyanu so nangla ta shala ta komgu yujirde. Chidang tso lipiga tso yan damban doyan ta, ene chi kaso tase taya ti mato shida yo marwa. Yina ti kaso re. Tsoba shechi tso che teya ti tunda marwa ko. Chi she ene tsoba tso ya jang tolo tso ya ti marwa. Tsoba tso ya ti ko tiwa tili ne che tok tso yu na pa tsu ti she ra. Tokba meba chen tunda di ngune di za tso so na, ne komba tso che nyamni tso che ne ti digidwa. Shen de shenpa che. Ti rilam ki tona, ti kong long kyusen, taga sa yinji re se memba sa, ti re se, kyusen di re se, rilam di yinji miji kukdo, rilam tona shiba che. Ni shen sa suna, ne komya namju samlo tanya ti tso che ne yagudwa. Ti jasa di pata di, soba kyangja chun te, taga tso e marwa. Ti ko pike mambu diyo sa, ni tiwa tilin che mambu, ti tso sharma to, tso ti ko teba che, samba che, ni soso komya ti tso ori shira. 야, 어디 전 되더라. 다 내가 수수 내다 따기 까용용 지어라. 야.
So here it's important to know that whatever it is that we might study, whether it is the great texts or whatever, whether we're dealing with emptiness or bodhicitta or impermanence or any of these other topics, is we hear these various teachings, but then we need to use our own logic to establish it. That's how we are then able to kind of come to an understanding that allows us to meditate on this. So here we might look at the monasteries and say like, well, they're just constantly debating and this debate is sort of never ending. Well, the debate isn't just for the sake of debate, but really it's for being able to resolve those kinds of questions and doubts so that when you are doing meditation, you can get kind of deeper into that. So whatever it might be that, I mean, and things will change as we sort of progress here in the West, but having the kind of space in which one, I mean, really, we're trying to support hearing, contemplating, and meditating on these things, and doing so in a way in which one has a place, a venue to ask questions and kind of work that out in one's mind, chew over it, is something that is really important for then the success in being able to do that. So at the monastery, we see people gather and they do a lot of debate and they gather and do various kinds of saying prayers and so forth. But then whatever they have understood, they're meditating on their own in their own room, for example. So here, having that kind of questioning and debate is really important. And Genla had before cited the verse from the Buddha's scriptures about really analyzing whatever the Buddha says, and this is something that is very important.
다 투중식도 투중세대 최신예들와 알레 티식도 삼사 삼중식도 삼중식도 소소 규전 삼르단데 소소 르람게던데 하고조에더라 삼중세대 제바토는 삼기 고베 규생카레 멤베 규생카레 고바카레스티 소소 규생의 제베거나 하고나 알레 티모네레도 디제 탐제메다 방고네레도 아삼 라 가레네티 삼중식도 티 relams 토네 삼루타네 소소 리바 소소 삼루타네 니바니에텔 삼중게 과시라 텔 relams 고요라 규생데 고요라 에네 곰조세 아단 자체 사선 다 고메데 야네 양도 곰리제 야네 양도 곰리제더라 어 티행한주 티 삼루탄신고도 곰스데 티 잠바닝지 창주심도 곰네 남산 옵티컬이 찍게르지 고게 나와시아기도 티 매나 코까지 삼루타나 티 네바체르체르 로요라 티 아코라 박차샤고라 니만 딱바르스티 삼루타나 시테나 니리니리네 박차샤 콤바체르체르 로요라 남산 옵티컬 오당아 틴데 남산 차섬데 틴데 매나야 곰세데 티 팬데기와르도 어 데디그리 어 퇴섬 곰숨시기도 어 디나리아네 투중 삼중 곰중오세테 삼중 디나라 relams de mane 규생데 삼루타이도 고도 어 틴데 트레스텔레시아
So here we have this term that is like arisen from hearing. I mean, that's what we sort of know upon first having heard something. But then we have that which is arisen from contemplation. And how do we get the kind of wisdom that arises from contemplation is through using reasons, logic, in order to establish this for ourselves. Like we hear, oh, all compounded phenomena are impermanent. Well, then using our own logic and reasoning, establishing with inference that all phenomena are really impermanent. That's how we develop that kind of wisdom arising from contemplation. It doesn't just come from our having heard it. And then once we've established that kind of understanding through our own thinking and contemplation, then we meditate on it in the sense of becoming familiar with it, or like familiarizing ourselves again and again and again. Now, when we hear about things like love and compassion, we might think, oh, I can just meditate on this immediately. Well, we can't generate these kinds of qualities immediately in our mind, but rather it's the more that we engage with it, the more that we habituate, that we're eventually able to develop those sorts of qualities or realizations. So if we think about something every day, if we have heard about it and then think about it again and again and again, that's how we really develop our understanding and are eventually able to give rise to the kind of wisdom arising from meditation. So we talk about hearing and thinking and meditating, and really we should understand what it means to be arisen from hearing, just that sort of cursory knowledge, versus what we get when we have contemplated and have that level of knowledge versus meditation. So thank you, and Tashi Dale.
지금나 야고도
One more thing.
소라 가서 슝데 슝게 때 셰드 근데 셰드 뭔가도와 이제 되셔야 탑시가 시담가 요봐. 그바 뒤에 되잖아. 식전제다 삼자르시 겔렌 잡아니 봐셔. 겔렌데나 르글람데 용거라. 그바데 샤우라 티시 단다 테르다스. 뒤뒤 단다 뒤뒤 샤우라. 치기 단다 샤우라. 삼자 슝아친 델드 샤우라. 근데 담아들려 겔렌 잡아니 봐셔. 테텔린 가와테도 아티 인고 주생 카르메 테덴 가와다 렌이부터 어디 르글람데 테덴 고고도 어텐 디그리야. 셰더 별랑아 소송고라.
Mm. Okay, so one more thing to say is there are sort of 5 methods for learning the text, or sort of engaging with a text when we are talking about these great texts. And so one is sort of knowing the purpose, and then there is the sort of overview. Then there is the kind of the words itself. Then there is the sort of relationship between things, like where the various topics kind of meet and have their relations. And then there is understanding the sort of contradictions and clearing those away, the responses to those. So these are called the 5, and they may be a little bit off, but the 5 branches of knowing a text and the methods of that. And so that is something additional to keep in mind.
Oh yeah, this. I'm gonna finish it.
Now we're really finished.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, tukchen angela.
I'll do that.
May the spiritual teachers who lead me on the sacred path, and all spiritual friends who practice
it
have long life. May I pacify completely all outer and inner hindrances. Grant such inspiration, I pray. May the lives of the venerable spiritual mentors be stable, and their virtuous actions spread in the 10 direction. May the light of love songs teachings dispelling the darkness of the beings in the 3 worlds always increase. Idam Guru Mandala Kamyatayami. To this merit may we soon attain the awakened state of Guru Buddha, that we may be able to liberate all sentient beings from their suffering. May the precious Bodhi mind not yet born arise and grow. May the born have no decline, but increase forevermore. In the snowy mountain pure land, you're the source of good and happiness. Powerful Tenzin Gyatso Chenrezig, may you stay until samsara ends. We pray for the long life and good fortune of Gen Rinpoche, Geshe Yeshe Topke. May you teach and live for a long, long time, and we may always take teachings from you in the future. Katrina, thank you so much.
Yes, you're very welcome. Always a pleasure.